So currently within our SART team, I represent and speak on behalf of the deaf community and deaf victims. The members of the SART team are able to hear our story. I identify challenges within our community. Of course, we keep everything confidential and don't include names. But I think that hearing from scenarios from deaf victims would be very beneficial. Simply hearing from me doesn't have as great of an impact. Currently, we do not invite deaf survivors and do not have any deaf survivors in the SART meetings. I would love in the future to have a deaf survivor attend meetings, and I think that would be imperative for them to share their story in their words. It would be very powerful to have the SART team hear directly from a survivor who is deaf. The barriers that they experience with law enforcement, for example, how that can be improved. That individual could share barriers in mainstream programs, how that could be improved. The deaf survivor could share what they would like to have improved in the community. I think that would be more powerful than me simply sharing as an advocate, because I'm not sharing my stories, I'm often sharing their stories. So I think the impact is greater, and I would love to see that in the future.
We know the needs of all victims and survivors are not being met. And so we want to change. It stands to reason we would want to change, incorporating the perspectives of the people who felt left out of the way that things are being done right now. So we've tried a bunch of different strategies with some success in some areas, not in others. We try online anonymous surveys where we'll give sort of specific questions. We'll have focus groups. We'll get together a group of victim survivors to talk about it. The trouble is that often people feel more capable of answering the kind of questions that we need to ask when they're a few years out from what happened to them. But then the issue is when they're a few years out from what happened to them, their memory of what happened at that police precinct or what happened at that hospital might be a little bit dulled. And so then it's also going to sort of compromise the effectiveness of including their voices. And so it's a real challenge to engage their voices. I think in my experience, it's pretty universally understood how important it is. In the absence of the voices directly of victim survivors in systems change teams, what ends up happening is advocacy has to assume that role, which isn't quite right. I'm an advocate. It's not appropriate, and quite frankly, I don't want to be put in the position of representing the voices of victims and survivors. Of it all perpetuating this idea that there is a victim out there. There is a victim, there's a victim experience, and if we can just understand it, we can sort of construct a system that responds to it. Because the whole trick of this is that everyone is coming out of sexual violence with a different experience of what happened to them. The trauma is impacting them in different ways.
So one way that we include survivors is by actually inviting them to come to our community SART meeting, whether they want to come in person to talk about their experience or write a victim impact statement that can be read by their person of choice. Having survivor voices in our SART has been invaluable. A lot of the major changes that we've made have been because of feedback from survivors. So, for example, we had a survivor come in who had gone kind of through the whole criminal justice response, and at the end she kind of said, I wish there was just a book that I could have gotten right after my SANE exam that told me about this process, because I had to kind of learn it bit by bit and, through trial and error. So we were like, oh great, a book. We could do that. So we went ahead and our SART created a survivor's guide that actually goes step by step about what happens when you're engaged in a criminal justice process and has all the resources and numbers for advocates, of course, throughout that manual.
We as service providers, as law enforcement agents, whatever, district attorneys, every member of SART that has been in part of SART traditionally, we can't take it personally. We have to remember that it's the survivor's experience. And if the survivor has felt in any way not heard or mistreated, we have to honor that and recognize that maybe our response or our questionings or whatever piece of that happened is something we can improve on. We're not perfect, and we need to recognize that and allow to improve. When I think about a survivor, we're asking a survivor to share an experience that will change that survivor's life forever. We hope that it won't define who they are, but that we understand how traumatic that experience is. The survivor feedback is needed in order to better these systems because we're serving survivors. And so anytime I received any feedback, whether it was related to the nurse, whether it was related to law enforcement or the DA or whatever process that they were choosing, I always gave that feedback. And if there was time that our advocates weren't the best, I received that feedback too. And so we just need to remember that we're there for the survivor. If the survivor wasn't reporting, then the SART team isn't responding, right? So we have to hear our clients, we have to hear our patients, we have to hear our victim, we have to hear our survivor. And so in order for that to happen, we need to be okay with bettering our systems and being more trauma informed.